An excellent general introduction into process metaphysics and Whitehead. And now I'm hoping we could delve deeper into Whitehead's cosmology and his philosophy and try to extrapolate his relevance for contemporary problems. Once again, Adam, the floor is yours.
If anyone would like to, for anyone who is not familiar with the work of Whitehead, his main work is Process and Reality. This is a huge book based on his lectures delivered, the Gifford lectures. This is a highly prestigious occasion where the leading philosophers are invited once a year to present hold a series of lectures. So this was also, the majority of his books are based on lectures he gave. So Process and Reality is his main work. It has a lot of jargon. He uses lots of new words which you can't find anywhere else. So he invents an entire new language for thinking about reality. Prehensions, for example, that's very similar to what phenomenologists call intentionality. The directedness of something, so how something connects to something else, that's a prehension. It's like sort of a fancy word for relations, basically, but also talking about directionality. He talks about how everything is an actual occasion, for example. He doesn't say thing, so when he wants to say thing, he says actual occasion, for example, or something is existing thing. So he is very Whitehead was dissatisfied with the conventional language, and he invented his own words, basically. So you need to. So for a reader, there's I think a Whitehead word book which was written by John Cobb, I think. An American philosopher and theologian who was influenced by Whitehead. So before someone delves into Process and Reality, it's helpful to read the Whitehead word book. It's like a dictionary for Whitehead, which explains, in simple terms, what he means by each word. So Whitehead he introduced an entire, completely original cosmology, for example. He mentions words like superject, for example. Superject is it's a subject similar to the word subject, but it's something which integrates other entities into its existence, sort of what we would call a network in today's language. So that's like a superject. But there's many new words. So I won't go through every single one of these. Nexus, for example, again, that's also like a network, what we would call a network. Nexus is like a complex entity, so molecules connecting together, that's a nexus. Okay, but also a solar system, for example, that's also an example of a nexus. What's very appealing to me, there's lots of good things in Process and Reality. It's my favorite book of philosophy. I think it's my number one, but that's not why it's interesting. But rather the completely original cosmology that he invents. The subtitle of the book is actually an essay in cosmology. So his main topic is what the world is like, how the world is built, what are the building blocks of the world. And for Whitehead, it's all processes, basically. It's all changes, and it's not. He rarely uses the word time. He doesn't believe that there exists anything like time. So he brings this from relativity theory, the idea that there's not one type of time which can be spatialized. There's different kinds of changes always going on. There's also eternal objects. These are similar to Platonic ideas. Plato is the biggest influence on Whitehead. But these are also, strangely, changes. They're always in the present. So for an eternal object, that's sort of the driver of changes. It's something which is behind all of these stuff. Like God, for example, is an eternal object. So the final chapter of Processing Reality, it's the divine, the God. It's a very different God from the God we would usually recognize. Like for Whitehead, God is just like the process as a whole. The cosmos creating itself. It's like creativity, I think. That would be like a good synonym for what Whitehead thinks God is. Like we have these, very often these, we very often in religions we have God personified as a sort of almost like a human, like they anthropomorphize God. Then religions often make God into a human image. But for Whitehead, God is like beyond good and evil. He says that God is beyond good and evil. God is like all of the changes, like with the good together with the bad. It's like change in general, the creativity in general. So what is highly compelling for me, one of the most interesting, and for a 21st century perspective, the most interesting aspect, I think, is the way that Whitehead conceives of reality as social. Like he says that everything is social. Society isn't humans doing stuff with each other. Like that's usually like in the sociology course. Like I graduated, my bachelor's degree is in sociology, and like 99% of it was what human groups do with each other. Like a network is, it's human interactions, and it's very boring. It's not. I don't think that society and Whitehead was so refreshing for me, because for Whitehead it's all social, even like molecules connecting with each other. That's a society. Like a molecule made of several atoms, it's already a society. And that's like a very there were sociologists who thought in a similar way, like Gabriel Tarde, for I don't know how to pronounce it, was a French sociologist, Gabriel Tarde, and he also writes, for example, that everything is social, like in the natural world as well. So there's no difference basically between so society can't be reduced to the human realm, and that's a huge insight from
So
Whitehead, I think.
is this what is directly linked to what they call Whitehead's philosophy of the organism, or his notion of the organism?
Yeah, like what he calls the philosophy of the organism, it's his word for his own philosophy. So whenever Whitehead says the philosophy of organism says this, this, and this, he's talking about his own philosophy. So that's his expression for his own philosophy. Yes. So the aim is for a philosophy of organism, the way things connect with each other, the way reality creates itself. That is. So it's not a. So organism usually he uses it in a very different way from biology, for example. So for biology, it's like living bodies, basically. That's like an organism, a body, a cell, things like this, like cells in my body. That's organism, but that's a conventional organism. But Whitehead understands something completely different under the term organism. So it's more, I would really say, what later came to be called self-organization. So how changes happen, how this sort of self-creation. That's what he understands under organism. So it includes what we would call the inorganic. Like for Whitehead, this entire category of lifeless matter and like dead matter that doesn't exist for him. Like he in Science and the Modern World also, he completely rejects the idea that that here there are living things and out there like a stone or an asteroid or that's lifeless and purposeless and just dead matter which like isn't living. He completely, the philosophy of organism rejects this view of dead matter. That would be the basic meaning of the philosophy of organism. And he doesn't say there's zero difference between me and a stone. So that's not what he's saying. He's saying that there are levels of self-organization. So a stone can do maybe less stuff than a living animal. It's less free, for example. It can't, by itself, it can't change its movements. It's just like the two asteroids collide. They're just colliding. They can't change their directions so much. And an animal can, like an animal has sort of more freedom in this regard. So there are levels of this complex, what we would call complexity, and Whitehead already uses this word complexity, for example. So a living animal is sort of more complicated than a stone, for example, but there's no sharp divide between the organic and the inorganic. Like Whitehead just throws that out, says that that's just dualism. Like he mentions Descartes a lot, like Cartesianism, that there's mind in here and there's like dead matter out there. That's just valueless. Stones can't think, then they're like zero value.
If I may interrupt you for a second there,
Yeah.
you mentioned complexity, right? And so I'm interested because the complexity is an argument against reductionism, right? And it's supposed to point out the limitations of reductionistic thinking, that is applying a very specific scientific model to all reality, right? So another way to formulate, I think, if I'm not mistaken, the thesis of complexity is to say that there is an underlying activity inherent in reality. And there's other thinkers who have spoken about this, I think, other process philosophers as well as phenomenologists, right? And so I'm interested in this ontology of underlying activity because today that's a very weird way of conceiving reality because we think of simple organism, or there was, Big Bang, the standard model, gravity, and then at some point there were microorganisms, and so then they developed into more complex organisms, right? But this offers a very different framework, right? It says there's an infinite complexity activity underneath what we perceive to be a stable reality. So I was hoping maybe you could talk about this ontology a little bit.
Yeah, so Whitehead is an example of indeterminism. So determinism would be the idea that there are fixed natural laws. Science can reveal how these laws work, and these are like sort of fixed. And we just have to find out what these laws are, and we can understand reality. That will be like a standard determinism. And this connects also with like this old 19th century type of materialism, the idea that it's matter has fixed laws and it's not creative. So creativity is basically the ability to create new forms of behavior, new levels of organization. That's also what we would call an emergence. So for an indeterminist, you can't say that you have certain molecules on this planet and life will evolve from those molecules. You just need certain preconditions for something to happen, and it will happen because that's a law of nature. Like for an indeterminist, they would say, no, that's not how it happens. You can't, from A plus B won't always equal C. Like that's what an indeterminist position would be. That there are unforeseeable forms of evolution. So evolution is like always constant creation, constant novelty. Like Bergson also, the élan vital, the life force, or the life striving of life. Bergson also very much, that's the whole point of his book, Creative Evolution. The reason he titled it Creative Evolution is that his goal is to present a model of evolution which isn't teleological, which isn't A plus B equals C. Bergson rejects the idea that I can forecast the direction which life will take. Life always takes like unusual directions. I can't reduce it to the preconditions existing. Like completely unusual forms of life can be created. Now we can of course, and this is so Bergson and Whitehead, they were both indeterministic thinkers. So for Whitehead, reality isn't controlled by these fixed laws of nature, which are like eternal. And science, in many ways, has sort of caught up with Whitehead in many ways. Like today, there are a few physicists who would say that laws of nature are like fixed and eternal. Like today, it's more like probabilistic. So it's just there's a high probability that when I wake up tomorrow, the laws of gravity will work in the same way. It will be a huge problem if they don't. So, I can't say for absolutely certain. So that there's no certainty. Reality is contingent. It's just there's a very high probability that I wake up tomorrow and gravity on Earth works in the same way.
And and if I'm not mistaken, Einstein had a problem with this, right? Just like he had a problem with quantum mechanics, right? So, if you wouldn't mind, I would like to discuss something that you also discuss in your book on Bergson, which is the Einstein-Bergson debate, right? Which I find surprisingly unpopular. I'm surprised that that debate has not been as popular as, let's say, his debate with Freud, for instance, right? But yeah, I'm really interested in this debate because as I understand, they disagree. Einstein and Bergson fundamentally disagreed on the nature of time, right? So what's your take on that?
Yeah, this debate was, I think, one of the biggest misunderstandings of the history of philosophy and science. Yes, the standard view, which was accepted like conventional wisdom, was that Bergson was like the loser of this debate because Bergson didn't understand what Einstein was talking about. But I think actually the reverse is true. I think basically what Bergson was trying to do was expand relativity theory. He wasn't opposed to what Einstein was talking about, but Bergson wanted to expand it and talk about different forms of time. And the whole debate was sort of framed in a way that Bergson is just talking about psychological time, the lived time or phenomenological time. But what Bergson is talking about is actually something very different, I think. So for Einstein was very much a believer in determinism. He believed that there are deterministic laws which physics can talk about, and that there is we can measure time. We can say that time goes differently for two people. Like there's this thought experiment which wasn't invented by Einstein, but Einstein borrowed it. This idea that time would go differently for someone on like another planet, like very far away. Someone travels at like light speed, the time will be different for that person than for the guy who stays. And there's this, I think, and Einstein said that no, philosophy has a different time. He's talking about time as it really exists in the physical world. That's, I think, a huge mistake from Einstein, because this isn't the issue. This isn't the issue. The real issue for Bergson is that we can't invent deterministic laws for time. So I can't always say that time will go differently or how time will elapse. So Bergson is talking about something very revolutionary. Einstein is very much committed to this. So the speed of light, it's like the basis of physics even today. We measure everything in comparison to the speed of light. But time is something very much like, for example, one of the areas where Bergson's work was influential was biology, biological time, the time of the body, how much the body ages. And that's something which clock time can't measure really. Like I can't say someone is 70 years old, but if they take care of themselves, they can have like the body of a 50-year-old, for example. So that the time of the body is something very different from the time of how many years old someone is. how sick someone is, how much their body has aged. So what Bergson is talking about, that there are these kinds of forms of time as well that you can't reduce to clock time. So just by saying that the clock time of the person in the light speed, like spacecraft, would go differently, that says nothing about what their body's time will be, for example. So Bergson just wants to sort of make relativity theory more open and not just talking about the time of physics as such. So it was very much a sort of talking like neither. I think Bergson understood what Einstein was trying to say, but Einstein didn't really get what the fundamental issue was, what Bergson was talking about, unfortunately. And Bergson did make some mistakes relating to some technical stuff in physics, and that's what was magnified by some commentators. And this became an issue. Oh, Bergson didn't understand the physics. I think this isn't really the case. I think it was more a case of the physicist talking about their own thing and not really taking account of what the philosopher is saying, because who cares what the philosopher is saying?
Right, and that's so interesting because that brings us back to what we started with, right? For the process philosophy's conception of time, which is not a series of discrete points, or at least doesn't have to be, right? So that was the point, as you said, that Bergson said time doesn't have to be a series of discrete points, but it seems Einstein was insisting that it has to be. So, right. But let's go back to Whitehead and let's continue digging into his metaphysics, his process metaphysics.
Yeah, so Whitehead for me is basically, I think, the most important thinker of the 20th century, because process and philosophy really does give us like a holistic view of reality as such. So I think this is like we get an entire cosmology, and his basic point, I think, is that we really do have to go beyond the sort of scientific worldview and introduce like new concepts. Like the way Whitehead creates new concepts and new words is, I think, highly inspiring, even if someone doesn't believe necessarily that that's the final view of reality. So I think that's fundamental, and I think that's key for what I think is important. Also, I think highly relevant is the way Whitehead tries to destroy the subject versus object dualism. I think that's sort of started talking about this, the way like Descartes, it's like the fundamental enemy, I guess, for Whitehead, or the philosophical opponent, because like Whitehead diagnoses a sort of problem with this idea that out there is objectivity, and in here, in me, there is subjectivity. Like again, it's with the society versus reality issue, or society versus like non-human reality. Like this is, I think, the most important point of process and reality. That there's no limitation of the subject versus object. Rather, for Whitehead, what we would call subjectivity, but he completely rejects this word. It's the sort of the creative, active aspect. So that's like actualization. And objectivity like that will be passivity. But this is something which applies to all objects. So insofar as something acts, it prehends other objects. So prehension means like having an effect on something. That would be the best translation of prehension. So if I prehend, then I'm having an effect on something else. But something can also prehend me as well. So the actual occasions, objects, they prehend each other, they come into contact, they have an effect, they can have like huge effects on each other. They can even destroy each other. So like the asteroid which wiped out the dinosaurs, that prehended Earth at that moment, like 65 million years ago. So that's an extreme example of prehension. So it's coming into contact and having an effect. So in that sense, the asteroid was a subject in relation to Earth, and Earth was like an object in reality regarding the asteroid. So subjectivity and objectivity, they aren't things which happen just with humans and their connection with the world. This is, I think, what makes Whitehead's cosmology like in a sense post-human. So in the way that it's not anthropocentric. He's not talking about human access to the world. And this is, I think, one of the key reasons why I think Whitehead is so crucially important, and also what makes process philosophy interesting for me. Like, it has something interesting to say about the world outside humans. I think that's the key for me, and that's the reason why I choose thinkers like this. So, for me, an ontology, a cosmology, has to have something to say about everything. That's the crucial point. This methodological holism.
That's quite fascinating. Because scientism or being scientistic seems to be trapped in the Cartesian picture, right? And the referential theory of the scientific method and language. So really, it tries to sort of erase its own footsteps in coming up with what we call facts today, right? Because we are still under the scientific spell that the world is made out of discrete facts that are just waiting out there for us to discover them, right? But researchers like Stengers and Latour, they have demonstrated that there is not only a method, a complex method, which is probably and most likely or actually made up of effects and being affected, right? Because the scientist apprehends the object and there's a complex sort of interactivity, embodied interactivity, to use Merleau-Ponty's language, between the scientist and the object that he studies, right? And so I think this takes us a little bit into the political or the biopolitical aspect of science and the problem of ecology, because the problem of ecology seems to be inherent to the epistemic failures of modern science, to the philosophical failures of science, to see that the research process is much more muddled and much more complicated, and there are a lot of artificial sort of theoretical prosthetics that need to be applied to the research process in order to arrive at what we think are ready-made facts, right? And so I guess my question is, how can we use Whitehead, or how has maybe somebody already used Whitehead, to show these political and economic hypocrisies that drive towards a type of ideology that wraps itself around science and creates this false scientific image of what it means to do science?
Yeah, the key problem for Whitehead, which connects him to the later thinkers you mentioned, Isabel Stengers and Bruno Latour, is the fact versus value difference. So for like a Cartesian kind of, and also a scientific worldview, values are like subjective, human, stupid stuff like morality, things like that, which are only humans talk about. And out there, it's like value free. It's like objective. There's objective matters of fact, which are, as you mentioned, like waiting to be discovered. And I think this is a recurring theme in Whitehead's work, also in science and the modern world, that there's no such distinction. I cannot say, I don't have the right to say as a human that out there matter is like there's no values or no purpose in reality. That's like a human arrogance. I think that's what Whitehead is trying to say. That's like an anthropocentric arrogance to say that like inorganic things, they don't have purposes or values. Like nature has no self-value, for example, for a Cartesian, and I think this is too often too frequent feature of scientism. The idea that only we have purpose, and only we make and this is common even in schools of thought which aren't scientific, like existentialism, for example. When Sartre says that, I have to make my own freedom, only humans can be free. Like it's a similar way of thinking that I have to make my own choices, my own goals, and the world out there is like completely different from this. So for Whitehead and for Stengers and Latour, there's no fact versus value distinction. There's no value-free fact. So that this is the basic issue, that there's no matters of fact which are like completely objective or free of values, and this is very important for thinking about scientific practice. So Whitehead is a very the political aspect of Whitehead is very undervalued because it's not really at the center of what most people see in Whitehead is like cosmology, ontology, things like that, philosophy of nature. But Whitehead is also very much political in this sense. Like Whitehead mentions in Science and the Modern World that the specialization is like the biggest threat to civilization. Like he writes that this is like the biggest problem we are facing, because scientists specialize in certain areas, if a marine biologist is just studying the viruses of sea urchins, then that's like a very small area, and we sort of lose the big picture. And thankfully, there are signs that this is changing. You mentioned ecology, for example. There's lots of scientists working in like interdisciplinary ways, conceptualizing like climate science is a good example. Climate scientists have to deal with all kinds of things. They have to have like a big picture of stuff. And so there are changes like environmental sciences, but these didn't exist in Whitehead's time, this complex way of seeing things. And I think we're going in this direction, so Whitehead is optimistic that science can achieve this sort of holistic view, but only with the help of philosophy. So without philosophy, science remains like stuck in these special small areas of expertise. And the role of philosophy is to sort of broaden the perspective. So that's why philosophy is crucially important. And I'm very glad that you mentioned Latour, because I think Bruno Latour, who unfortunately passed away recently, he was like I think the most important representative, and Stengers also, that they are two of the most important contemporary Whiteheadians, if that's a good expression. So Whitehead was hugely influential for their work. So for viewing, because again for Latour everything is social, like everything is made of actor networks, and everything is an actant if it connects to something else. So it's not just humans doing stuff with humans creating power relations. It's way more complex than that. Everything is in play, like in a network for Latour. The roads, the infrastructure, objects, machines, everything comes together. And like his early work on laboratory life with Stephen Woolgar. So the work Latour did, like working in a laboratory, like matters of fact are like constructs for Latour, but not language constructs as such, or not just language. It's also actually you have to bring together lots of things to make lab results.
Right, it's a kind of pragmatism almost, right? Like a pragmatic constructs. Like they need specific social practices to be in place in order for them. So they have an objective effect on your life, despite being constructs, right?
Yeah, and they are, they are objective in this sense. Pragmatism is very important for Latour. Like the American pragmatist philosophers like John Dewey, William James, those are big influences on Latour. And in the COVID situation, for example, like you had lots of testing, like there were countries where the entire population was tested, and like from a Latourian perspective, it's not that the virus is a language or media construct as such, but that it's a complex result of testing and something out there in the world, and so testing sort of constructs a pandemic in many ways. So I'm not trying to sound like Latour isn't a relativist. He doesn't say, "Oh, viruses don't exist at all," or "There's no such thing as tuberculosis." So that's not what he's saying. He's saying that in order for something to become socially connected, it has to be translated. Like it has to be translated into the terms of that institutional network. Like Latour has this famous example of scientists discovered that Pharaoh Ramses II died of, I think, tuberculosis. They sort of did some tests on his bones or something like this, and they found out that the pharaoh died of tuberculosis. And Latour says that no, he didn't die of tuberculosis because it's completely anachronistic to say that. Like today, if he would have died, like when they know about tuberculosis, then we can say that. But we can't say that for ancient Egypt because that's a completely different culture,
Right.
and they thought about it in different terms.
And sorry to interrupt again, but
Yeah,
that's highly reminiscent of Foucault, right? Because Foucault says
yeah,
ages, different sciences and epochs or epistemic formations, they can't communicate with each other. They would be talking past each other if they tried to communicate, even or especially their scientific knowledge, right? Now, on that note, we have to take another break, but
yeah,
I do
sure.
want to see where this leads us.